need to evolve. It was interesting, there was a comment out there that being a 100-year-old company is no longer a gold star of excellence. It's almost like, oh gosh, when are you going to go to the farm and not live anymore? How are you continuing to reinvent yourself? How are you continuing to stay relevant? How are you going to make sure that you have a strategic vision that keeps up with all of the other organizations that continue to pop up? And one of the things that we have found that a lot of them look to build internally and realize quickly they don't have the talent to do it. So then they go out and say, okay, well, we want to really look at the landscape and maybe acquire digital talent and really look at digital talent as our strategic vision for the future. And what they quickly realize is that, well, just acquiring talent is no longer going to be acceptable, because you can't just bring in great talent, innovative ideas into a stagnated, old thinking, operationally driven organization, because you'll stifle everything that you tried to just acquire. So what we do is we try and work with them and say, okay, times are changing and we know that. What can we learn from history that helps to tell us this is the way you need to evolve? And how can we help you reinvent yourself and help you think about what your strategic vision is going to look like? So from a historical perspective, one of the things that we talk with our CHROs and CEOs about is that we've been here before. We know that change is happening. We know that work is changing. And it really started initially with the second industrial revolution. And I think what was interesting there is that a lot of people at that time, I was not there personally, but what I've heard is that they have all said, well, our jobs are going away. Machines are taking them over. We're making an industrial line where now I no longer have to put this widget on this thing. But what happened is their jobs didn't go away. They just needed to be reskilled to do other things, to manage those machines, to find different ways to integrate, which is no different from where we are today. It's just making sure that we're looking at deconstructing some of the things that they're doing today and making sure we're skilling them up for the future. The second one, which we call sort of the third industrial revolution, which is what we've deemed as sort of the Nikefication, and this is really more for HR. So HR has really evolved. It came from, we used to have personnel, and then there was like 5 HR people on site to no HR people on site. So there's been a huge evolution in that space. And what Nike did is they were the first pioneers to say, you know what, really in home base, that's where we need our innovation. All of this other stuff from a shared services perspective, we're going to offshore that. We're going to look at different ways in which we can service our employees that isn't sort of that one-on-one touch that we've done before. And a lot of people were scared, but that is the way most of the organizations sort of evolved to. And I think where we are right now is what we're calling sort of the Uberization, which is dealing with employees in different ways. Dealing with new employees that have different needs and demands, who have different expectations of what they want and where they want to be, and then making sure that we're integrating them within the organization and making sure that they're going to be successful. How do we reward them? How do we support them? How do we enable them? And how do we make sure that they flourish? Because this is the future of where we want to go. So when thinking about this, we know that everything is changing, right? And I think employees' expectations are changing as well. And I'll give you a great analogy of this. Well, it's great for me because I only have retail analogies. Sports, I'm no good at. So if you're retail, you can follow me. So what's the day after Thanksgiving? What is it called? Black Friday. What is the Monday after Thanksgiving called? Why is it called Cyber Monday? What was it? Online shopping. Do you know why it's on a Monday? Because people waited till they got to work to go shopping because they had better internet connection at work than they had at home. That's crazy, right? To think about that now, I would go to work for better technology than I have at home. I don't think anybody would raise their hand right now and say that that's the case within their own organizations. But that's the expectations of employees. It's changing how quick they can get information. They can go on the internet and find every answer they want. They go on the intranet site and they're like, I can't. It's like a black box of craziness and I'm just going to figure it out on my own. So the expectations are changing. The way people are communicating is changing. There was a recent stat out lately that the number of text messages that were sent and received in one day exceeded the world's population, which is so surprising. And I have a 13-year-old daughter, and I did think it was her and her friends, but apparently it's not. It's all of us included in that, although I heard now that Snapchat is more cool than texting, so I'm not really good at that. But apparently that's the way we're going to have to move forward in how we communicate and how are we getting ready for what that's going to look like and how we communicate with our employees. So the other thing that's changing is that roles are changing. We have roles in our organization today and in HR that we've never had before. A cybersecurity analyst, 10 years ago, that role didn't exist. A data scientist, now I feel like everybody's a data scientist these days, but to get a really good data scientist is very difficult and very hard to find. A chief digital officer, again, roles in which we never had before. I read an article recently that last year, one of the hardest roles to fill in Silicon Valley, does anybody know what it was? It was a poet. Wasn't that crazy to think, a poet? Wow, that would be a role that people would be looking for? I'm going to give you a real-life example of how this came to be in my own life. Over the summer, we're sitting at the pool. I have 3 kids. My son comes up to me, and it's a beautiful blue sky and a beautiful day, and he says to me, Mommy, is Santa Claus real? And I'm looking at him like, okay, it's summer. Why are you asking me this? But as any good mother, I turned around and rephrased the question to him and said, I don't know, buddy. Well, what do you think? And he says, I don't know. Let's ask Siri. And I was like, oh my God, no, don't ask Siri. And I'm going for the phone, and he's going for the phone, and I don't know how to work it, and he does. And he asks Siri, and Siri comes back and says, only naughty children ask if Santa Claus is real. And I'm like, oh, thank God. It saved me. And then I remember reading this article. I'm like, that's why we need poets. We need writers to be able to help write some of these things and make sure that it is applicable to the things that are going on. So it's impacting us in any way that we look at it. I think one of the other important things here for us to think about is, so we have all of these changing forces, all this stuff that's influencing the way we are as an organization. But really what needs to happen is we need to think about, well, what is our strategy as an organization? And our strategic vision in most organizations we work with is really influenced by a lot of external factors, a lot of things that are happening. And a strategy never is stagnant. It always evolves. It evolves with who you are. It evolves with all of the new up-and-coming and emerging competitors that are out there. It evolves as the time goes on. But what we have found is that a lot of times the strategy of an organization does stagnate. So they say, yes, we want to be all these things. We want to make sure we're reinventing ourselves, but we're never going to change our internal process. And a great example of this is we work with a lot of organizations that are going through this problem, and we'll sit down with the CEO and their leadership team, and we'll say, well, where do you want to go strategically? And they say, well, we want to be on the cutting edge. We want to think about things before our competitors are thinking about them. And we really want to be more innovative. And so as all good consultants, we would never tell them no, but we would ask them nicely and say, well, okay, we're not going to argue with you. You want to be more innovative. Let's talk about how you get work done here. You know, do you allow for diversity of thought? And they say, yeah, well, we like diversity of thought. Do you allow for failure? And then they come back and they're thinking about it a little bit. And then we say, do you allow for the best idea to win, even though if it wasn't from one of your leaders? And then they're starting to question themselves. And then they come back and they say, well, failure. You fail once here, you never, ever come back to that team again with the same idea. And so then we lightly push back and say, you're never going to be successful at being an innovative organization if you don't allow for some of the key characteristics of how work actually gets done at an organization that is focusing on innovation. Not only that, you're never going to be successful at acquiring an organization or a specific product that you want if you don't allow for the right type of talent to flourish within that organization. Because employees aren't stupid. If you tell them, we want you to be more innovative, they know what that means. Then they'll operate that way, and if they're not rewarded in that way, you wind up having very disengaged employees. And the moral of that story goes is that the more engaged employees you have, the higher return on investment you're going to get from them, because they're bringing their best self to work every day. They're giving that level of discretionary effort, going above and beyond for you, which are the things that you want to make sure you're reaping all of the positive benefits out of your employees. Now, one of the big things on top, you can see that bar, that leadership bar. This is extremely important because we'll sit with the leadership team and we'll say, who do you want to be? Where do you want to focus? And they'll say, oh, yeah, we all want to be innovative. And yes, we're going to change. And we call it the bobblehead syndrome, where they're like, oh, yeah, that's what I want. And then they leave and they're like, I don't know what she's talking about. And I don't want to do that. And I didn't agree to anything. We're just going to go back to the ways in which we were doing things. Well, we know that doesn't work. We know that in order to impact change, you need to make sure that your leadership is on board. Leadership really drives 80 to 90% of the culture. And a lot of people question that stat because they say, well, isn't culture really grassroots? Aren't you really driving it from the bottom up? And yes, there are aspects of that are true, but you're really looking to the top to model the behavior. What's rewarded? What is the gold star of behavior that we want to have here? And leaders are typically the ones who are going to emulate that. They're the ones who are going to set the tone. A perfect example, it's not around specific culture, but I did work with an organization that, they were really radical, and they were like, we're going to wear jeans on Friday. It was like, yeah, this is one thing everybody wants, and we're going to do it. And so we sat with the leadership team, and the CEO said, we did that. We thought that would help change, but nobody wears jeans. And I said to him, well, do you wear jeans? And he said, well, no, I don't wear jeans. I'm like, so nobody else is going to wear jeans. It's a simple example of you need to model it. If that's what you want out of your people, you need to make sure that you're doing it as well. And so when that all starts to happen and leadership is aligned, then that's what we definitely want. Now, we know that culture impacts everything. So it's not just about the way in which work gets done, but it's also about your process. It's about, as we said before, some of the leadership capabilities. It's about your people, your systems. Everything needs to be aligned in order to make sure that you're impacting the level of culture and culture change that you want within an organization to get all of those positive benefits. But culture change is hard, and there are a ton of case studies of where it is not successful. A fair amount from mergers and acquisitions, especially when an organization looks to acquire, whether, again, it's specific talent or it's a specific product. A lot of times it's not successful because they can't have the culture in which they need to drive. Also the same when you have new leadership coming in. So how many of you know about the Microsoft story, about the new leader, their new CEO? So they were going through a transformation, and they were getting a new CEO. And there was a lot of talk about the person that they hired and promoted into this role was someone internal. And they really did feel like Microsoft was on the brink of distinction, almost, because they weren't relevant anymore. They weren't continuing to reinvent themselves. And if you Google, well, I shouldn't say Google Microsoft. If you use Bing, and you try and find something, there's this cartoon that's out there that talks about the structures in certain organizations. Amazon all up at the top, Google has all the lines going across, Facebook and their social network. Look at Microsoft. So they had a storied history where there were always conflicts. They were always fighting with each other. It wasn't the best idea wins. It was the best idea wins and you no longer survive, because that's just the way we do things around here. And they needed to change that. And the market said, well, if you bring in someone internal, you're never going to impact change. You're never going to get what you want. But luckily, they did. So they wind up promoting one of their internals, he's a lifer at Microsoft. He has a fantastic book out, and this was an article that was written in Fast Company. But what he did is he said, you know what, we need to change our culture. It's not just about changing our business strategy. We have to stop pretending to be someone we're not. We have to make sure that we're rewarding everybody, and we have to make sure that we don't accept behavior that's not aligned to who we want to be in the future. And so they did that, and he calls it a learn-it-all culture. And he really adheres to the growth mindset. I don't know Carol Dreiker, if anybody knows her. She's a famous psychologist. She's done a fantastic amount of research on growth mindset, and he has applied that there at Microsoft. And they've been quite successful since he's taken over, because what they said was, let's not pretend to be everyone else. They did a Nokia acquisition. That didn't work. We're not going to get into the phone business. Let's make sure that we can find ways in which we can maybe latch on to some of the emerging technologies instead of trying to be the emerging technology, which was really fantastic, and again, a great case study of how they were able to change. So when we sit with organizations and we say to them, well, who do you want to be? Like, what kind of culture do you think you need to have here? We did a fair amount of research where we looked at high-performing organizations. So organizations that were high-performing from a financial perspective, and those that had high scores from an engagement standpoint, meaning that their employees were really kind of firing on all cylinders. And what we found was that they really started to compete and differentiate themselves in these key strategic priorities. And so we'll sit down with organizations and leadership teams, and we'll put this in front of them. And we'll say, okay, from this and from our research, where do you think you guys fall? And what they'll come back is they're like, I like a little bit of this, I like a little bit of that, I think we're a little bit of everything. And we always push back and say, you can't be the best at everything. It's okay if you have aspects of each of these in your organization, but you really need to differentiate yourself. You need to put a stake in the ground and say, you know what, this is really who we are today, but this is who we really want to be in the future. And how do we get ourselves there? And that exercise is very helpful for organizations when they're going through transformation, and for HR to help to support those conversations. So for an organization to say, you know what, we've been very quality driven, and that's who we are, and that's how we're known, but we really need to evolve, because our focus on quality has really dropped off on our focus on customer service. And we really need to make sure that we're aligning ourselves to be more of a priority in that space. So when we work with them, we do a fair amount of consulting and days and days and days of on-sites with them to figure out where they wind up from this perspective and have leadership alignment. Then we go a little bit further and say, okay, you want to be innovative. What kind of people do you need to have working here? How do you need to change your hiring practices? How do you need to change the way in which you reward? So what we know is that there are general characteristics of organizations that are focusing on innovation. We know that leadership behaves a different way when you want to create a culture of innovation. Decision-making is going to be different in a quality-driven organization versus an innovative organization. And how do you make sure that that happens? One of the other things that we know is that there's also all these supporting systems from an HR perspective that are different for innovative organizations versus others. So how do you make sure you're acquiring talent? What's the characteristics you're looking for? How are you rewarding these people? Because they may want something just a little bit different than your traditional employees that you have had in that organization for a while. What does career management look like? They may want to move more fluidly through the organization than maybe what you've had in the past where people sit in the same role for 5+ years. As we said before, leadership and capability and development, as well as workforce planning. And then all of the supporting functions underneath from an HR perspective need to be aligned as well in order to make sure that you're going to be successful at driving this type of culture change. So putting all of those pieces together, so we know, okay, fine, we need to have a good strategy in place, we need to have the right culture, we know things are changing in an organization, okay, we've identified all this, how do we measure it? How do we make sure that we have an impact? How can we sustain what this is going to look like? Because just doing an exercise for 3 months isn't enough. What is this going to mean more long term? The first is understanding everything it impacts and all of the things that you're going to need to do to help to adjust for it. So the structure of your work and your careers, your tools and your processes, the community, what does success look like and how do we reward that level of success? How do we drive some of that change? All extremely important components. The other one is listening to your employees. So how do you create a listening strategy where they have a voice in helping to shape what your future looks like? How do you make sure that you course correct along the way? We've worked with a ton of organizations who we go through all these exercises, we do all of the work we should do, and then we test employees and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. We don't operate like this at all. And then we have to go back and say, it's not permeating. You're not doing the right things. But we have to have an open dialogue with our employees to make sure that happens. Whether that's sensing, whether that's pulsing, whether that's virtual focus groups, whatever it is, HR is looking for solutions in this space to say, how do I make sure that I'm leveraging the data I have to make sure I'm making an impactful and meaningful change? But at the same time, how do I work with my employees? How do I make sure that they feel like we have an open dialogue? And this is an area of opportunity we see in HR because they don't necessarily have the tools in place in order to do that, or at least in a seamless way, or it exists in 700 different places and they can't pull it all together. So this is extremely important. The other thing that we find that's very important is also making sure that there's a compelling value proposition. So a value proposition is when I'm going to give you something, and what are you going to give me in return? It's kind of like a quid pro quo. But in this instance, it's for an organization. So I'm going to bring my best self to work every day. And what are you going to give me in return? From full circle, not just career development, but how am I going to be rewarded? What's in it for me? And organizations really struggle putting that on paper. And it's really hard to differentiate for themselves who they are and who they aren't. But this is extremely important in companies really retaining their employees and making sure that they have the right focus on what that looks like. What's interesting as well is when we talk to them about how are you going to acquire the talent you want, it's not just about keeping your people, it's also about acquiring them. We work with a lot of companies focusing on candidate value propositions. So if you've ever gone to like an employment fair or you've talked to a recruiter, they sell you this big, long, storied story about this great experience you're going to have. And what we have found is that a lot of organizations, there's a disconnect between that. So we did a study where we were working on a company's employment brand, and we brought their employees in a room, and we showed them candidate value propositions that the recruiters were doing in their competitors as well as theirs, and they couldn't pick their own companies out. And when we said to them, this is actually what your recruiters are telling your future employees, they're like, oh my God, That is nothing like us. I hope they're not telling them that because they're going to be disappointed. We don't do things like that. That's not the experience our people are having. And that's a big disconnect from a promises made versus a promises kept, and it's happening all over the place. And HR has a role to play in how do you adjust that and how do you make sure that you have alignment when it comes to the different things you're telling candidates, but as well as giving a good employee experience. You want to hold on to talent, at least a lot of organizations, for longer than a year or two. And how do you make sure that you're giving them a good experience and you're meeting them in the middle of where they want to be? I would say the other thing that's related to this is total rewards. How do we make sure that we have a total reward strategy that is also aligned to what our employees are looking for without using segmentation on generations? I hate that when we're all like, oh, well, the millennials want this and the Gen X's want that. That's actually not true. That's just stereotypes and what we think people want. But what's really interesting when we actually ask them what they want and create plans that are segmented and prioritized to their needs, we find that they have higher satisfaction. And that's really where a lot of organizations in HR is tending to go, is how do we customize what people are looking for? So challenges. There's tons of challenges out there for organizations that I think there are solutions in this room that exist to help with those challenges, as well as areas where we're starting to make some progress. So how do we build capabilities? I think that's a big key piece of it. And as I said before, when I'm working with CEOs and we're talking about acquisitions that they want to make, I would say about 10 years ago it was acquisitions on actual products versus now where they're looking at acquisitions on actual talent. So they want the product, but what they really want are the people, and they don't want the people to leave, which is very different than it would happen in the past. In the past, they'd acquire talent, and they'd be like, I don't really care if they stay for a year or not. We have the talent, we have the tool, and we'll plug the tool in. That's no longer the case. So that's a big issue I think a lot of organizations are facing, and understanding how do we make sure that they have a good experience. Driving culture change, as I said before, huge issue that we're seeing across organizations. It's more about sustainable culture change. Scaling is a big issue because they can't find a way in which they can scale some of their solutions, the things that they're doing. There's a lot of customer needs, there's a lot of risk involved, and there's a big struggle in there on how they think about what that looks like holistically. I already talked about making sure that they remain competitive. A lot of organizations need to do that, especially those that are more long-term. We're seeing it time and time again. We're seeing a lot of churn at the top level of organizations when they're not getting it right. Everyone's kind of reinventing themselves. Attracting, retaining, and rewarding digital talent is huge. I think if anybody says that they don't have a problem with that, they'd be lying. Not only because it's not that there's not enough out there, they just can't get them to stay. They can't get them to want to work for them. One of the best commercials, anybody saw that GE commercial? It was, I mean, I know everyone's recording TV these days and you probably don't watch commercials, but there's a great GE commercial. You can go on YouTube, not yesterday because it was down, but today you can go on YouTube and look at it. And what it says is it's this commercial where this guy says, oh, I got a job. And he's telling his friends about this new job he got. And they say, oh, you're leaving Zazzy's, which is like, you know, where he's creating these, this cat that speaks in an app. And he goes, well, I'm going to work for GE. And they're like, GE? What are you going to work for GE for? And he says, well, I'm going to be able to innovate and do all these things. And they're like, oh, but you don't want to make the cat dance anymore? And they're like, no, I kind of actually want to make an impact on the world. And so it's a great example of how organizations are struggling, especially some of those who really do want to reinvent themselves because their brand stands in the way. So digital talent is key. And then what new roles and skills and structures and processes are actually needed? Can you do a needs assessment? Do you decouple and deconstruct the jobs that you have today and figure out what you need for the future? So my time is up, but I would always leave you with challenges. Hopefully you guys can help us come up with the solutions. Interested to have any continued dialogue with all of you, and hopefully this was helpful. And I think we have time for questions later, but I know we're running a tight ship and I'm bumping up against someone else. So thank you.